Hey listeners, I'm Alex Staniforth, and this is Go the Travel Podcast, a podcast about travel, places, and for today's story, adventure. All of our episodes so far have been about travel to places like Cuba, Iceland, or Argentina. But in this episode, we're going to tell you an adventure story about Mount Everest.
I just remember this huge crack above my head. This was the sound of ice breaking off the mountain. That's when panic set in.
That's 21-year-old adventurer Alex Staniforth recalling one of his two attempts to summit Mount Everest, the tallest mountain in the world.
I wasn't your likely prospect for Everest. I wasn't active or outdoorsy or into challenges at all. It was all about overcoming adversity.
Not your typical adventurer, Staniforth suffered from health conditions that would have held back many people.
Had epilepsy when I was 9, only a very mild form, but was enough to really shatter my confidence at such a young age. Relentlessly bullied throughout my entire time at school.
Staniforth suffered from panic attacks, depression, and eating disorders. He knew he had to turn this around and take control of his circumstances instead of letting them control him.
Well, whatever challenges we face, we don't always get to choose them, but what we can control is how we deal with them.
He started challenging himself with tasks that he never thought he could do, like rock climbing, scuba diving, and competitive running.
That constant proving limits thing, it's really empowering, and I never felt it before.
This set him on a path to push further and to try and conquer one of the world's toughest challenges.
I had this kind of eureka moment one day when I asked myself, where is Mount Everest? And I saw a photo, and that just captivated the journey. That gave me my purpose, that gave me a chance to really prove myself wrong. And so from then on, I just went higher and higher.
Still a teenager, Staniforth would need years of physical preparation before he could make an attempt. And he would need to prove himself as a mountain climber.
But it's all about taking steps. I mean, my first sort of taster of altitude was the Alps with Mont Blanc when I was 17.
Standing at 15,781 feet, Mont Blanc is the tallest mountain in the Alps. Climbers in Europe who want to be taken seriously have to complete this summit before they can move on to higher climbs.
That then gave me the opportunity to go on higher, to try a 7,000 meter peak in the Himalayas called Barunsi.
Mount Barunsi is one of the many mountains climbers summit before making an attempt on Everest. Standing at 23,500 feet, there is less than half as much oxygen in the air than at sea level. This would be Staniforth's first time climbing at extreme altitudes and his first time experiencing high-altitude mountain sickness.
My first real high experience. Before we even got to Merah Peak High Camp, I was really suffering with probably the early onset of HACE, high-altitude cerebral edema, which is a nasty thing to have, really nasty.
HACE is a severe type of altitude sickness that can occur at altitudes over 15,000 feet, where the brain begins to swell. Once at Merah Peak High Camp, Staniforth's condition wasn't improving.
And so with that, realised very quickly it wasn't going to happen. So came back down. I was in a bad way and more ill than I've ever felt in my life.
HACE causes climbers to suffer headaches and confusion. Loss of appetite, vomiting, difficulty walking, and slurred speech are other signs and symptoms. HACE has been compared to suffering from a hangover and the flu at the same time. It can also be life-threatening if left untreated.
I was basically told if I didn't recover the next day, I was going to be helicoptered out. It was that bad.
The only sure fix to anyone suffering from high-altitude sickness is to go to lower elevation, which is what Staniforth and his team did.
So the drop in altitude certainly helped. Amazingly, a bit of time lower down was all I needed, and I recovered quite quickly.
Climbs like these require acclimating to the altitude. Climbers do this by gradually ascending in elevation, giving the body time to adjust to the thin air and low atmospheric pressure.
A week later or so, we were at Barunsi Base Camp, and I was back to strength, and then we went for the top.
After successfully summiting Mount Barunsi, Staniforth was ready to push for Everest. But one of the biggest obstacles to getting there is a financial one. He would need to raise $45,000, which is hard to do when you're still in school.
I was still at school, yeah. I was sort of 17, 18. Still recall taking days off school to go and sit in a boardroom with like the CEO and a managing director of a big multi-million turnover company. I'm there in a suit with a stammer trying to be taken seriously.
Staniforth spent about a year fundraising and going to meetings like this. But one of his biggest challenges was standing out from the crowd of people seeking sponsorships.
It's about how you market yourself. There's lots of people trying to do this, and in my position, I didn't have wealthy parents to just sign the check. I had to go out and work for it, like big time, with corporate sponsorship, fundraising through businesses.
The money eventually came, and Staniforth raised the last of it only a few weeks before he departed for Nepal.
And so it was end of March 2014, we flew to Nepal for what should have been a 2-month expedition.
2 months is what it takes to climb Mount Everest and return home. Most of those days are spent acclimating to the altitude and waiting for the weather conditions on the mountain to clear up. The weather is the most unpredictable part of the climb. Winds there can reach up to 200 miles an hour, and temperatures can drop to negative 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Conditions like these have killed over 250 people on the mountain. Today, only the most experienced climbers are able to lead expeditions up to the top.
The trip was led by a British mountain leader who's now climbed Everest 5 times. So I was in a well-supported team.
Most people arrive at Kathmandu, Nepal, before flying to a town called Lukla, which has the closest airport to Mount Everest. From here, climbers have to hike to base camp, which sits at 17,600 feet and can take several weeks to get there.
We set off as normal. We got to base camp. It took us about 3 weeks.
Base camp is the setting stone for Everest climbers. It's a small temporary tent village that can house hundreds of people in the spring. A lot of time is spent here preparing for the next several weeks of hiking to camps further up.
And then you've got camp 1, 2, 3, and 4, and then you've got the top. So you move between them to acclimatise, basically.
Climbers spend weeks hiking up and down these camps, preparing their bodies for the altitude. But before they even arrive at Camp 1, they have to hike through an area called the Icefall.
The Icefall is probably the most dangerous section of the route. It's a pretty unavoidable obstacle, to get to Camp 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. You have to move through it.
This part of the climb has claimed more lives than any other part of the mountain. That's because it's part of the Khumbu Glacier, so there's a high chance that the ice will move.
Because it's constantly moving, you've got the risk of falling ice, you've got the risk of crevasses.
Crevices hundreds of feet deep have been known to open up at random. The bodies of some climbers who've fallen into these have never been recovered. Large towers of ice stick up out of the glacier and have been known to break, dropping chunks of ice the size of cars and houses down below.
And it's quite spectacular. It's a real stunning landscape.
Since the path through Icefall changes every year because of the moving glacier, several Sherpas will have to go ahead and find a safe route.
Sherpas are the ethnic people of the Himalayas. They are the most superhumanly strong people I've ever seen.
Living at these high altitudes, Sherpas are better adapted to hikes at high elevations, and they accompany nearly every expedition up Everest.
I mean, the Sherpas are amazing, and I know every climber will tell you this, but they really are a highlight for any trip to Nepal. They do become good friends very, very quickly, even though they live in such a different life. A lot of them make a living from the mountaineering. We essentially use them as our support team.
On April 18, 2014, 25 people, mostly Sherpas, were setting up the route through Icefall. They checked the snow and ice for stability. Over the deep crevices, they constructed temporary bridges out of ladders and rope. Meanwhile, Staniforth and his team were hiking to base camp.
A day before we got there was the huge avalanche in the Icefall.
The high-altitude avalanche hit early Friday morning just above the mountain's base camp at more than 20,000 feet.
The worst disaster ever seen on Mount Everest. An avalanche this morning claimed at least a dozen lives.
The avalanche killed a total of 16 people, all Sherpas. The entire climbing season was canceled before Staniforth and his team could even begin the climb.
We had to pack up and go home, having not actually got above Everest Base Camp.
But Staniforth was determined to give it another shot. A year later, at 19 years old, he returned to base camp.
Got to the base camp and we set off on our first rotation. The first rotation, you go to Camp 1 for one night, and then you go to Camp 2.
Prepare to push through the icefall. Staniforth and the rest of the team loaded up their backpacks and put on their gear. Crampons, helmets, ropes, and carabiners are just a few of the necessary pieces of equipment needed to traverse the terrain.
Our team had left base camp about 5 in the morning whilst the ice is more stable. After sort of 5 long, painful hours, I mean, it's exhausting, absolutely exhausting. We were probably less than half an hour away from Camp 1.
Having crossed over deep crevices on ladders and under large ice towers, Staniforth had nearly finished crossing the deadliest place on Everest.
At this point, I was on my own because my leader and a teammate had dropped behind me by about 10 minutes. And 2 guys are about 10 minutes ahead. Everybody else had just raced ahead. I mean, I was struggling big time that day.
At this point, Staniforth is standing at over 19,000 feet in elevation. The altitude and lack of oxygen was taking a toll on his body.
And I was so tired that I would just remember pulling on the rope and just keeping on pulling one step at a time. And then that's when the Nepal earthquake hit.
Earthquakes of this high 7.9 magnitude are rare. This is the worst to hit this Himalayan nation in over 80 years.
The earthquake struck before noon local time in the capital city of Kathmandu.
Old brick buildings simply crumbled, with many people trapped under rubble.
I just remember this huge crack above my head, like splitting the whole valley. And that's when panic set in, because I realised that this was the sound of ice breaking off the mountain. Behind that, you've got this distant rumble of an avalanche coming straight at you. The fog that day, the visibility was so bad that we probably couldn't see more than maybe 20-30 metres away. And so you hear this noise booming at you, but you can't see it. So you can't run and you can't hide. You just have to set off as fast as you possibly can. And all the time looking, trying to work out where this thing's going to come from. And after a short while, you just kind of hear the noise getting closer and closer, like an express train, louder and faster. But you assume that it's fallen behind you because it should have hit me by now. And then suddenly the air pressure just flips and it just hits you with this whack like a ton of bricks. At first it knocked me over. It wasn't solid as you might imagine, it was just a cloud. It was just a big battering of wind and this roaring noise coming at you from every angle. You've got this soft snow going into your face and you turn your head away to try and gasp for air, but it's like being suffocated. Just kind of thinking, you know, when is it going to end? When's it all going to go black? That was the first time I really realised what was going on. And I guess at 19, genuinely for the first time in my life, for a few seconds thinking, this is it. This is how I die. Yeah, that's the most sickening feeling of fear. And then nothing, it just stops like that. And then you open your eyes and you look down and you're shaking head to toe, but you're still here. You disbelief.
Staniforth and the rest of his team survived. The main path of the avalanche just missed them. Instead, it struck base camp, where they had been only a few hours earlier.
A huge avalanche, like a tsunami of rock and snow and ice that just came down, absolutely whacked base camp, which has never happened before. And sadly, 22 people died at base camp.
The avalanche surpassed the previous year's death toll, becoming the deadliest event in Everest's history. Staniforth's team was stuck at Camp 1 for 2 days before they could go back down. When they got to base camp, they found that 3 members of their support team had died, all of whom were Sherpa.
That was a massive loss because for them, you know, they're just doing their jobs and they were meant to be in the safe place. Our tents were buried under a foot of rock and snow and ice had we been at base camp.
Staniforth says he doesn't have plans to return to Everest anytime soon, but it's not off the table. Despite being only 21 years old, Staniforth has overcome a lot. Even when things haven't turned out as planned, he keeps pushing.
Success is about coming back stronger. Whatever challenge we face, whether that's chosen, like a marathon or Everest, or whether it's out of our hands, it's how we respond to it. That's why sometimes the biggest obstacle is ourselves, is how we respond to those things.
Right now, Staniforth is busy conquering his next obstacle.
My next project, which is actually completely different to what I've ever done before, called Climb the UK. It's the highest point of all 100 UK counties, so cycling, walking, running and kayaking.
Staniforth is currently on the road doing this challenge. If you want to keep track of him, we'll have a link to his social media accounts on our page at gothepodcast.com. If you want to find out the whole story about Staniforth's life, you can get his new book called Icefall. Thank you, Alex Staniforth, for sharing your story. Don't forget to subscribe to Go the Travel Podcast and find us on social media. Share this episode with a friend or a family member and let us know what you think. I'm Alex Walensky, and this is Go the Travel Podcast. Thanks for listening.